Hi everyone, and welcome to day 19 of the Battle of the Poets project. I'm back today with my special guest star here, who just decided he needed some snuggle. So if you hear purring, don't be alarmed. Um, so I have for you today the results of our first round 2 vote. I asked you guys to take a look at Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken and Billy Collins's Cheerios. Again, super close race here. It seems these two are pretty divisive, but last minute tiebreaker, Billy Collins has won. So Billy Collins will be moving on to round 3, and we are going to be moving on today to our next round 2 poet, who is Louise Gluck. So Louise Gluck, if you remember, we talked a little bit about her. She is an incredibly well-respected person in the writing community. She's still writing. She's still a professor. And she actually won the Pulitzer Prize. And this book, The Wild Iris, is the book that we read from last time. And we're going to be reading another poem from it today. The idea behind The Wild Iris is it's a series of poems that are all written from the perspective of plants in the garden and the perspective of the gardener. So last time we read one that was from the perspective of the gardener, but today we're going to be reading one from the perspective of the plants. So the main focus for today is line breaks. So when people think about poetry, we talked about this yesterday, they often think about rhyme. They think, well, a poem's supposed to rhyme. That's kind of what we're taught from a lot of the poetry that we learned first as children, because a lot of poetry for children does rhyme. However, that's not really a rule for poetry, but one of the things that is kind of distinctive about poetry, not all poetry, mind you, there is some that doesn't adhere to this, but most poetry, is that it doesn't take up the entire line. So when you're looking at a book of poems, you usually see these kind of short lines, and they're usually broken up into stanzas. So, I can flip through here, and regardless of the poem that I'm choosing, I'm going to be seeing some line breaks, okay? Because modern poets don't use rhyme, they had to find another system by which to decide where to break the line. Because, like we talked about yesterday too, it used to be that lines had to be a certain length, they had to be a certain amount of syllables, or they had to have a certain sound at the end of them, or there were other kind of ways of deciding that. Once those rules went out the window, modern poets had to decide, well, where do I end the line? Do I end it at the end of a sentence? Do I end it somewhere else? So we're going to read today a poem called Snowdrops. And Louise Gluck has some really interesting choices about where she chose to end her lines and to include her line breaks. And I want to talk a little bit about those because they might seem a little unexpected. And it does affect how you read the poem and how the poem sounds. Snowdrops by Louise Gluck. Do you know what I was, how I lived? You know what despair is, then. Winter should have meaning for you. I did not expect to survive, earth suppressing me. I didn't expect to waken again, to feel in damp earth my body, able to respond again, remembering after so long how to open again in the cold light of earliest spring. Afraid, yes, but among you again, crying, yes, risk, joy in the raw wind of the new world. So that was Snowdrops by Louise Gluck. I also forgot to mention that snowdrops are, of course, the very small white flowers that are one of the very first flowers to come up when it first stops snowing. And they're called snowdrops, I think, because they often poke through the snow. So they're kind of the heralds of spring, but they endure some tough weather. I know mine in my front lawn endured a lot of snow this spring. So let's talk about these line breaks by Louise Gluck. She chooses to break her lines in a really interesting spot. And the technique that she uses is one that's used by a lot of modern poets, and it's sort of based on being able to read the line 2 ways. So for instance, she chooses to include in her first line, she says, do you know what I was, how I lived? You know. she includes "you know," which is the beginning of the next sentence, to kind of answer her own question. But when you continue reading, you realize that that sentence really belongs to the next line. You know what despair is. So if she had broken it, we would have read the poem like this. Do you know what I was, how I lived? You know what despair is. It's very different than, do you know what I was, how I lived? You know what despair is then. So oftentimes, especially modern poets like Louise Gluck, they will break their lines in places that are ambiguous so that you realize as you're reading, hey, that could potentially have two different meanings. And that way they're getting two meanings out of one sentence, which is kind of an interesting thing. And because poetry is all about kind of being very condensed with your words, except maybe if you're T.S. Eliot, but it really is about using as few words as possible to express your point, and that makes it really important to have multiple meanings within one sentence. So I hope you guys enjoyed this poem by Louise Gluck. I hope next time you're reading a poem that you take a look at where the poet chooses to break their lines, because it is a really deliberate choice for them, especially in free verse. So we'll be back tomorrow with our next poet, and we'll continue on with round 2. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the day.